Hi there, my name is Meredith Fain. I'm a professional coach, and today I want to talk about why you might feel like you are doing all the right things, but you are still super stressed out, okay? I hear this all the time from my clients. I've been down this path myself, and so I want to share my framework, my paradigm for how I look at this issue, and hopefully that will reveal why a lot of the really popular sort of stress management, self-care, quick tips and hacks that we see on the internet and in self-help books don't quite get at the core issue, and why you might be kind of, nibbling around the edges of this challenge, but still feeling like the core problem of this chronic stress pattern is still intact for you. So let's dive in. So the sort of foundational understanding that I want to set out for us here is that there are a lot of different sources and sort of input channels that we have where stress can enter our system. They're complex, and each one of those different channels or layers or input sources of stress is intertwined. So each one impacts and influences all of the other ones. So that means that our solutions, our approach to unwinding these chronic stress patterns also need to be holistic. They need to be interconnected, and they need to sort of be aware of the whole system in play. So here are the different sort of layers or input channels that I'm referring to. This isn't necessarily a completely exhaustive list. Lots of other practitioners have slightly different ways of slicing and dicing this, but for simplicity's sake, this is how I view it and how I sort of approach this with my clients. So layer one, sort of like the most dense, concrete, basic physical layer. These are things like your exercise, your food, your sleep, your water intake, what medications you're taking, supplements, all that stuff. Pretty obvious things. Some of the go-to things most of us think about when we're thinking of stress management. There are a lot of sort of scientific nuances in each of these that can certainly influence how your physical inputs are impacting your perception of stress. We're not going to get into those details today, but just know that this physical layer, which is often where a lot of our conversations about stress start and end, is really just one piece of this puzzle. The next layer to this is the emotional layer. So our feelings, our sensations, our emotions, usually these are sensations that have a label attached. So it's really sort of the intersection of a physical feeling as well as a mental label, which segues us to our third layer here, the mental layer of stress. These our beliefs, our values, the stories, the judgment, the inner critic, those voices that we all have, the Greek chorus that lives inside of all of our heads. All of this comprises the mental layer, and lots of stress can be sort of wired in at this input channel. The next layer is the spiritual layer, and this can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I'm not here to judge or comment on that in this conversation, but for anyone, regardless of your philosophy, your heritage, your belief system, at the most fundamental level, we can define this spiritual layer as a sense that there's something bigger than you out there. There's some meaning, there's some purpose, sort of overarching this entire story that we are each living through individually. And stress can exist at this layer as well, depending on how you relate to that concept. And then last but certainly not least is the social layer. So this is all of these other pieces are sort of internal to ourselves. The social layer is, of course, how we interact with other people outside of ourselves, and even systems and ecosystems outside of ourselves. So that's sort of the framework and the paradigm that the rest of these slides will anchor on, is those 5 different layers, and this idea that we can have stressful inputs happening at any or all of those layers, and it will impact all of the other ones. Okay, it's a very holistic, comprehensive approach. Now, what does stress look like? Just some examples at all of these different layers. Okay, and as I'm going through these, if some of these are setting off alarm bells and really resonating for you, make note of that. At the end, there'll be a quick recap of the slide where you can actually score yourself and see how you're doing on each one of these. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. So examples of physical stress patterns. Some of these are really obvious, right? Exhaustion, poor diet, not getting enough sleep, muscle tension, headaches. Sometimes this will manifest as people either over hyper exercising or under exercising. You may have subtler things like digestive issues, inflammation, skin issues, all kinds of great stuff going on at that most basic physical layer. Emotional stress patterns. Overactive empathy is one that I see a lot in my clients. It's one I can certainly identify with, where you feel like you're kind of the sponge. You're absorbing everybody's stuff. You're an empath. You're feeling it all. That can actually be a sort of traumatic reactive stress response when that gets kicked into gear. Feelings of deep brokenness, feelings of I'll never be good enough, I'm unlovable, I'm unsafe. These are really, really classic places that a lot of us go. Some of these could fall into sort of the mental category as well, but these are very, even if we take away the words, if you think about the sensation and the feeling underneath those statements of I'm broken, I'm unlovable, etc., you can kind of feel viscerally where that would land in your body emotionally. At the mental layer, frequently folks will have sort of uncontrollable racing thoughts, or compulsive or obsessive type circular through that hamster wheel in your brain that you can't really get off of. Others will experience, a deep, deep need to be needed, or to be the best, or the most accomplished, or to always keep a really safe distance for themselves from anyone and anything else. Mental stress patterns can also look like negative self-talk, perfectionism, self-doubt. Just a few examples, but there's many more out there. Stress at the spiritual level can feel like you are deeply alone in the universe. No one will ever be able to understand me. Nobody's got my back. I have no safety net. I have to control everything. I am the sole author of my own destiny, and it's up to me to get it right or not, right? This can also look like an inability to sort of trust and relax in the bigger picture of life, because again, all that pressure is on you alone. It can also feel like a sense of just profound meaninglessness and pointlessness. At the social layer, stress patterns can manifest as codependency, being the savior, being the rescuer, having really poor boundaries, not being able to ask for help, right? You're always helping other people, but you can't accept it in return. It may look like passive aggression, right? Because we're not comfortable with direct assertive communication. Or it might show up as trying to control another person, okay? So these are just some examples. Again, if any of these are setting off alarm bells in your head, you are not alone. This is all very classic, very common stuff. So just make a mental note, and we'll come back to this in a moment, okay? So the reason that I share all of that is because my philosophy on why a lot of our sort of quick transactional superficial stress management hacks don't work is because they're only addressing one or two of those layers at a time, and only like maybe one little bite-sized subcomponent of those layers. Really, it has to be addressed and unwound at every single one of those layers, not at like the exact same instant, but holistically together around the same time. So what does that actually look like to be unwinding those stress patterns? Well, at the physical level, it looks like learning enough about sort of like basic owner's manual level information about our bodies, about nutrition, about exercise, about supplements, about any of the medication that we're using, to be able to actually understand how to take really good care of ourselves and then implement that in a disciplined and consistent way, so that we're not unnecessarily adding just exogenous biochemical fuel to the stress fire, okay? At the emotional level, unwinding these stress patterns looks like learning to ride those waves when the really painful, intense feelings come up. So we're not running away from our emotions anymore, but then also come out on the other side of that, not damaging ourselves or anyone else, but instead learning to self-soothe, self-regulate, come to a place of calm and centeredness and ease and compassion within ourselves. At a mental level, this looks like getting super clear on what those sort of destructive, counterproductive thought patterns, that mental talk track is, getting clear on those, and then starting to reprogram and counterbalance them. It also looks like using all of your logical, rational left brain computing power that you have in your mind to make plans for yourself that feel like you do have a safety net, right? So that you're not getting kicked into stress response because you're worried about, your basic material needs being met. At a spiritual level, unwinding these stress patterns looks like learning to connect to a larger purpose of some kind or a larger source, and beginning to experiment with trust and releasing control and finding some peace and some safety in that sense of a larger connection. At the social level, this looks like healing attachment trauma. I know every single thing on this list is like, that's a big thing, easier said than done, right? I hear you. Yes. This is just high level, but yes, healing attachment trauma, which has all kinds of stuff underneath it. Practicing reciprocity, being able to both give and receive in a balanced way in relationships, making sure that you are in a social context where you are being validated and you're providing that back, where there's a lot of healthy empathy, assertive communication, and so on. Okay, so these are some really, really big, meaty, gnarly things to unwind and then to relearn at every single one of these levels. Okay, I'm not suggesting it's quick or easy or simple, but this is how I view the holistic picture of what needs to go on to actually start making meaningful change at the root cause level to unwind the reflexive patterns of chronic stress that have been sort of encoded in us just from a heck of a lot of time and repetition. So like I mentioned, most stress management chicks only address one or two layers at a time, right? Which is understandable. It's a lot. Otherwise, it can feel overwhelming. The goal here is not to overwhelm you, but just to give you a paradigm and sort of the bigger picture of what this actually looks like if you want to tackle it in a serious, comprehensive way that isn't just nibbling around the edges. And like I mentioned before, every single one of these layers informs the other. So let's skip back for a second. If, for example, you are super focused on, maybe the mental layer, right? Maybe you're in therapy, maybe you're doing CBT or some other, gold standard, wonderful treatment path like that. Awesome. Nothing wrong with that at all. And if you're doing that in isolation, you are still, eating a highly inflammatory diet, you're taking, lots of stimulants in the form of caffeine or other things. If you feel like, you're alone and the universe is a dark, scary, horrible place, if you're in unbalanced relationships, right, that CBT is a hell of a lot better than nothing, but it's also not going to be the silver bullet cure-all thing. To give another example, if you're really doubling down on the physical layer of this, that's one that I've certainly been guilty of myself in the past, because I love being a doer. I love checking all the boxes, feeling like I figured out all the science. And so you can get hyper focused on I'm going to have super regimented diet, super regimented exercise, I'm going to drink my water, get 8 hours of sleep a night. But if you are in toxic relationships as you're doing that, if you do feel like you get triggered easily and you have no way to sort of come back and re-regulate your nervous system, all of that physical effort is just going to be putting a band-aid on the problem. And it's going to feel really exhausting and demoralizing to keep expending so much effort in one layer, but not ultimately getting to that deeper issue underneath. And this is why. Okay, so moving forward again. All of these layers, like I said, informs the other. So you need to take a more comprehensive approach, because otherwise it's like a hydra, right? You cut off one head and then it regrows from another place. So like I mentioned, I'm bringing this previous slide back up so you can just take a quick second to sort of self-assess where you're at in each of these different layers or dimensions. So I'll pull them all up here. And again, I'm just showing some of the examples again. And for each one, I want you to sort of go through, and you can do this on a scratch pad off the side of your desk or in your phone or wherever, and just kind of take a minute, tune in, think about where you're currently at, where your stress levels are currently at for each of these layers. And you can sort of tune into the symptoms I've listed here too, if that's helpful. And just say sort of 0 to 5 scale. 0 is like no stress at all, easy breezy, loving life, super relaxed, everything's awesome. 5 is like acute pain, misery, super intense, bad, high stress. 0 to 5. Just give yourself a quick score on each of these. Okay, so where are you at on the physical layer? How's your stress doing there? On the emotional level, 0 to 5, current stress level. And don't get too hung up in the examples I've listed. This may show up in other ways for you that I haven't captured here. So, take sort of an intuitive stock and make it your own. At the mental level, how is your stress level? 0 to 5. The spiritual level, what's your score? And lastly, at the social level, how is your stress level doing? So make sure you've captured those. And I'm not going to ask you to do anything with these scores moving forward. This is more just for your own self-inventory. And it can bring just a little bit more awareness and nuance to maybe in some of these dimensions, you're like crushing it. You might be over-indexed on some. And other ones you might be totally ignoring, or they might, you might just not even have really ever thought about them before. So this can give you a picture. Some folks' scores are going to be really kind of even. Others will be like wildly skewed. I know I've certainly been in that camp myself in the past. So again, no like homework for you necessarily out of these scores. It's really just to begin to open up some awareness for you. Now, the other piece that I think is really important as to why a lot of surfacey stress management tricks don't work long-term is that for a lot of folks, especially if you're, in those sort of different symptoms that I listed, the different manifestations, if you're at kind of the extreme end of a lot of those things, very frequently underneath that is a history of trauma. Now, it's a loaded word. It's one I talk about a lot. This could be anywhere on the range of like extreme, horrifying, very obvious capital T trauma that anyone would recognize as such. Or it could be something a lot subtler. It could be something chronic. It could be something that was purely emotional or relational or verbal that maybe you didn't even recognize as trauma at the time, or maybe you're still not totally comfortable leaning into that word, right, as a label for what you experienced. But very often, really most people who've survived to adulthood have been through at least one mild trauma. So this is very, very common for most of us. And any event like that will imprint and really heighten our stress responses. And if we don't address that, then we get kicked into sort of overdrive, those protective mechanisms, which is, later on will manifest as these negative stress symptoms. They stick with us and we're extra scared and we're extra rigid and we're holding on to them extra tight because of something that happened earlier on in life that taught us that we were not safe, right? That's usually the pattern that happens if we trace it back far enough in these cases of fairly intense chronic stress. Now, that context, that trauma context, is really, really important. It's very formative, and it really shapes and defines so much of the trajectory that we experience thereafter, so many of these symptoms that we are looking at and discussing here. So when you sort of gut the trauma portion of the chronic stress conversation, you can still have a meaningful conversation. You can still do great work around it. And that label is not going to fit for everyone, but for a lot of us, it does. And the clearer you can be about tracing that back and addressing your stress from that vantage point, it becomes a lot easier to sort of loosen up some of these chronic stress response patterns in our bodies and in our minds. Now, healing these patterns takes time, it takes support, and you have to go sort of gently through it. For a lot of us who are in go, 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 hyper stress, hyperachiever mode, all of the time. What we want is something really, really fast and frankly pretty aggressive that happens, sort of like a one and done, like I'll take the pill and I'll be fixed. And I'm willing to go through any amount of sort of intense pain in the short term to just get this over with, right? That's also a trauma response. Spoiler alert. But really a lot of this, it's deeply wired stuff. It does take time. It does take guidance. It takes expertise. And learning pacing, gentleness, balance, moderation, learning to honor sort of your tolerance, time frame, and window. All of these are things that most people coping with chronic stress never learned how to do. That's why we ended up in this situation in the first place. So even the mere act of going through sort of a healing, recovery, unwinding of stress process, how you go about doing that is actually itself part of the healing. It's part of the learning, right? Going through that in a way that sort of instills moderation, helps us build trust with ourselves, that we don't have to just throw ourselves into really aggressive, chaotic situations rapidly and jerk ourselves around over time. Okay, so very important that we sort of set that expectation and that perspective around what this looks like to actually seriously engage in the sort of stress repatterning work. Just very briefly, the reason that I am so passionate about all of this is because I have been there. I have had all of the sort of worst stress coping mechanisms you could possibly imagine at all of those different levels. And slowly over time recovered from that after a few different nervous breakdowns, after career changes, after massive life changes, chronic health problems, depression, anxiety, all of those things. I've been there, I get it. And I am deeply, deeply passionate about helping other people who I see are on that road too, right? These are high EQ, high IQ sort of combo, high achievers, usually professionals, sort of mid-career-ish, who are super, super stressed out. They have it all together on the outside, and on the inside, they are crumbling. They are collapsing under the weight of all of this garbage that made them really successful at the beginning of their careers because they were in that hyper stress, hyper performer mode all the time, never taking care of themselves, never asking for anything from anyone else. It makes you really successful for like a super short period of time. And then you wind up having really severe health ramifications, happiness, quality of life, relationship ramifications down the road. So I love sort of catching people at that inflection moment where they realize this is not working for me anymore. I look great on the outside, I'm dying on the inside, and I need something different. Okay. That's where this whole paradigm that I've been sharing comes from. This slide is just, we'll go through it very quickly here, but I am a certified coach. I have an educational background in nutrition, cognitive science as well, some training in the realm of NLP, and specifically I work especially with folks who have chronic relational trauma, narcissistic abuse, borderline personality disorder abuse within a family or romantic relationship. I work a lot with highly sensitive people, empaths, people who are very anxious, perfectionistic, and have sort of been living with all of the life ramifications that come out of those patterns that get instilled very early on. So that said, last piece really here is that changing these patterns, these chronic stress patterns at all 5 of those layers requires both doing, right, outward behavior change, routine, discipline, execution of tasks. That's the stuff most of us are already really good at. That's our comfort zone for a lot of us. So there's a component of that. And then there's also a co-equal, just as important component in the being realm, right? Which is more about awareness, internal, interoception, connection to self, mindfulness, mindset, perspective. Both of those pieces, you can sort of think of them as left brain and right brain, logical versus intuitive, whatever dichotomy makes sense to you there. Both of those components have to come into play here. So all I've done in this video is lay out sort of the problem statement and a way to think about it. As far as actual interventions, changes, mindset shifts that support each of these different categories, that's a huge, very, very lengthy discussion. There's also, very individualized and personal in the best cases. So I share lots of information, tips, tricks, tools, personal stories, client stories around different subcomponents of this framework that I've laid out. And the best way, if you're interested in this stuff, you want to hear more, you think some of this might resonate for you, is to hop on my email list, which is listed right there. And I will send out free emails every week with some of the best content that I have curated around these topics. And of course, if you ever want more individualized support, you can feel free to reach out to me at that website as well. I hope this has been helpful. I am thinking of you and wishing you well. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Okay, take care.